Three men stood in Beijing in September 2025. One had ruled his country for over 25 years. One had inherited a nuclear state from his father, who inherited it from his father. And one nobody had even heard of just 26 years earlier. They were casually discussing immortality. And that last detail, that's the one that should terrify you. Because the story of how Vladimir Putin went from a rat-infested apartment block in Leningrad to quietly joking about living into the 22nd century is not just a political story, it's a dynasty story. And dynasties, as history keeps reminding us, rarely appear out of thin air. So, where did the Putins actually come from? The honest answer is, we don't fully know. And that mystery, that carefully constructed fog around one of the most powerful families on Earth, is exactly what makes this story so unsettling. Let's start at the very beginning, not with Vladimir, with his grandfather. Russia in the 1800s was not a place where ordinary families left records. Serfdom, basically legal slavery, wasn't abolished until 1861. The country's first full census didn't happen until 1897. Huge swaths of the nation east of the Ural Mountains were barely mapped, let alone documented. So, tracing any Russian family back beyond the 19th century is more guesswork than genealogy. What historians have pieced together is this. The Putins lived in the Tver Governorate, a region northwest of Moscow on the road to St. Petersburg, not powerful, not wealthy, not notable in any way. But then, one man changes everything. Spiridon Ivanovich Putin, born December 19, 1879, grew up during a time of famine, radical political upheaval, and a Russian empire cracking under its own weight. When he was just 12 years old, the catastrophic Russian famine of 1891 struck. Millions were starving, and his parents did what desperate families do. They sent him away to work at a cousin's inn. One fewer mouth to feed. That's where the Putin story actually starts. Not in a palace, not in a government office. In an inn during a famine, with a 12-year-old boy doing kitchen work just to survive. But here's where it gets strange. A few years later, Spiridon moves to St. Petersburg, the glittering westernized capital that Peter the Great had literally built from a swamp on the Baltic coast, and he starts working as a cook. Now, that sounds unremarkable, until you follow the thread. Because Spiridon Putin, this man who began his career feeding inn guests during a famine, allegedly ends up cooking for the two most powerful men in the history of the Soviet Union. First, Vladimir Lenin, then Joseph Stalin. Let that sink in. A man from a peasant family in rural Russia ends up preparing the meals of the man who launched the Bolshevik Revolution and the paranoid dictator who killed millions of his own people to maintain control. If true, that is not a coincidence. That is a family embedded, however quietly, in the very heart of Soviet power. And it gets deeper. Because Stalin, a man so paranoid he had people executed for looking at him wrong, didn't just let any chef near his food. Anyone cooking for Stalin almost certainly had to be cleared by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, the direct predecessor of the KGB. So, the argument goes, Spiridon wasn't just a cook, he was probably one of them. But here's the problem. Almost everything we know about this comes from one source, Vladimir Putin himself. In 2018, Vladimir sat down for a 2-hour documentary simply called Putin. He was interviewed by a journalist named Andrei Kondrashov, who conveniently became Vladimir's election campaign spokesperson around the same time. In it, Putin described his grandfather's work for Lenin and Stalin at a dacha outside Moscow. And from that interview, the story grew legs. Historians, journalists, and researchers started digging. And what they found, or more accurately, what they didn't find, is the real story here. There's very little hard evidence to support the version Vladimir tells. Archives that should show Spiridon's proximity to Soviet leadership don't. The claim that he cooked for these men for decades is almost physically implausible. Spiridon died in 1965 at age 86, which would mean he was an active chef well into his 80s. Standard logic says, if your grandfather had been a trusted insider to Lenin and Stalin, your family would have had privileges, connections, protection. But the Putins in the mid-20th century were poor, genuinely, grindingly poor. So either the story is embellished, or the benefits of proximity to Soviet power went to other people entirely. What happened next changed everything. and it starts not with Spiridon, but with his son. Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin, Vladimir Sr., was born in 1911, married at 17, moved to Leningrad, joined the Navy, and then the Nazis invaded, June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in human history. 3 million German soldiers poured across the Soviet border. And the Putins, like nearly every family in Russia, were suddenly fighting just to stay alive. Vladimir Sr. was a submariner redeployed to ground combat on the Leningrad front. In November 1941, he was sent behind enemy lines with a small unit to capture a German soldier to extract information. They were 30 kilometers from the outskirts of Leningrad. Most of the men sent with him didn't come back. Vladimir Sr. barely made it out. Wounded, frostbitten, collapsed in the snow, rescued by fellow Red Army soldiers. He spent months in hospital recovering, which, in a dark twist of fate, meant he was not sent to Stalingrad or the Kerch Peninsula. Battles so lethal they were essentially death sentences. He survived, but he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And while he was lying in that hospital bed, his family was being destroyed around him. His mother-in-law was killed by an artillery shell west of Moscow. His second son, Victor, died of diphtheria in June 1942, disease spreading through the collapsed infrastructure of a city under siege. The siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days, nearly 2.5 years. Over 1 million civilians died. When it was finally lifted in January 1944, Vladimir and Maria Putin were given an apartment, 5th floor, Baskov Lane, no hot water, no washing facilities, a single gas burner, a communal toilet crammed into a closet by the stairwell. This is where one of the most powerful dynasties in modern history was about to be born. October 7th, 1952. Maria Putin, now in her early 40s, having buried 2 sons, gives birth to a 3rd boy. They name him Vladimir, after his father. The child grows up in that apartment. Rats are a constant. The corridors and courtyards of Baskov Lane become his world. He joins a street gang, not out of malice, but out of necessity. That's just how you survived in post-war Leningrad. He goes to school, studies chemistry and magnetics, gets a diploma, not a university degree, more like an advanced specialization. Then he heads to Leningrad State University to study law. And somewhere in those university corridors, Vladimir Putin makes a decision that will define the next 50 years of world history. He joins the Communist Party, and he sets his sights on the KGB. Now, here's something most people get wrong about this moment. The conventional image of someone joining the KGB is a sinister choice, a moral compromise. But for a kid who grew up watching his parents struggle in poverty, who grew up in a country where the state controlled everything, who had seen what proximity to power could do, the KGB wasn't a dark path. It was the path, the only one that made sense. He enters the 401st KGB training school immediately after graduating, spends years in training, administrative work, intelligence gathering. There are wild stories that he traveled to Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, working undercover in the Pacific. Almost certainly false. The reality is far more mundane and far more revealing. He sat at a desk in Russia, writing reports, waiting, building, and then, in 1985, he gets his posting. Dresden, East Germany, the front line of the Cold War. Dresden is where Vladimir Putin watches an empire die. Mikhail Gorbachev has come to power in Moscow with radical ideas: glasnost, openness, perestroika, economic reform. He's trying to modernize the Soviet Union from within. But reform, once started, is almost impossible to control. Protests erupt across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet bloc's answer to NATO, begins to fracture. And then, on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall falls, not with bombs, with people. Citizens just walked through the checkpoints after Hungary quietly opened its border with Austria, rendering the entire Iron Curtain's western flank pointless. And Putin, KGB agent, stationed in Dresden, watches it happen from the inside. At one point, an angry crowd surrounded the Dresden KGB office. Putin reportedly called Moscow for instructions on how to respond. Moscow didn't answer. That moment, that silence from the center, is said to have shaped him profoundly. A superpower that didn't protect its own agents, an empire that collapsed not from military defeat, but from internal rot and indecision. He returned to Russia in 1990 after helping destroy KGB documentation in the Dresden office. He came home to a country in freefall. By December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union was formally dissolved, and everything Vladimir Putin would do for the next 30 years can be understood as a response to that moment. His rise after that is almost uncomfortably fast, if you know where to look. He reconnects with Anatoly Sobchak, a law professor he'd known at Leningrad State University. Sobchak becomes mayor of the newly renamed St. Petersburg in 1991. Putin becomes his deputy. And in the chaos of 1990s Russia, where state assets worth hundreds of billions are being sold off to whoever has the right connections, a sharp, loyal, quiet man in a position like that can accumulate extraordinary amounts of leverage. Not money necessarily, something more valuable. Allies who owe him. By 1996, Putin is transferred to Moscow. By 1997, he's deputy chief of the presidential staff. By 1998, he's head of the FSB, the new intelligence service that replaced the KGB. And then, on December 31st, 1999, Boris Yeltsin, drunk, ill, and exhausted, goes on television and resigns. He names Putin as his interim successor. The world had no idea who this man was. In the presidential election 3 months later, Putin won comfortably. What followed looked, for a while, like a success story. The Russian economy, which had contracted almost every year through the 1990s, turned a corner. In 2000, it grew by 10%. Over the next 8 years, it averaged 7% annual growth. Oil prices were rising. Russians, after a decade of misery, were actually getting wealthier. Putin was popular at home. Abroad, Western leaders saw him as pragmatic, reliable, Yeltsin without the chaos. Germany became so dependent on Russian natural gas that an entire energy policy was built around it. The NATO-Russia Council was established in 2002 to facilitate dialogue. When the 9/11 attacks happened, Putin was among the first world leaders to call President Bush. The West thought they were watching a reformer. They were watching something else entirely. Because while Western capitals were extending olive branches, Putin was doing something else entirely in the background, in the Caucasus, in Chechnya, in Georgia. In August 2008, Russian forces invaded Georgia and carved out 2 breakaway states, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, officially independent. In reality, new Russian territories. The international response? Muted. Russia was briefly removed from the G8. That was essentially it. And Putin took note. In 2014, protests in Kyiv forced out Ukraine's pro-Russian president. Within weeks, Russia annexed Crimea, then invaded eastern Ukraine. The Minsk agreements tried to create a ceasefire. They failed, slowly, year by year. Then in February 2022, the mask came completely off. A full-scale invasion, hundreds of thousands of troops, missiles hitting Kyiv. The West finally responded with serious sanctions. But the economic math didn't work out the way anyone expected. Sanctioning Russian oil caused global energy prices to spike, which meant European countries paid more, while Russia earned more. Russia's wartime economy, initially at least, boomed. By some estimates, Russia has lost over 1 million soldiers killed or wounded in Ukraine, a number so catastrophic that by 2024, Putin was asking Kim Jong-un, the 3rd generation of a North Korean dictatorship, to send troops. Think about that. The leader of a nuclear superpower calling the hereditary ruler of one of the world's most isolated states, asking for soldiers. Back in that Beijing ceremony in September 2025, 3 men strolled toward Tiananmen Square: Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and they talked about organ transplants, about biotechnology, about the possibility that people might live to 150, maybe never die. The international media laughed nervously. 3 authoritarian leaders discussing immortality. The irony seemed obvious. But here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. Putin's daughter Maria Vorontsova isn't in politics. She's a pediatric endocrinologist leading research teams with enormous government funding into life longevity, organ printing, and anti-aging methods. Her father is talking about living forever. Her research is trying to figure out how. And Putin himself, despite 20 years of breathless reports that he's dying of cancer, Parkinson's, blood disorders, appears to be in good health at 72. He won't turn 80 until 2032. Russia might be controlled by the same man for decades more, and the family keeps expanding. His first cousin, Igor Putin, became a prominent banker and businessman, conveniently, after Vladimir became president. Heavily sanctioned since 2022, but wealthy. Igor's son, Roman, is building a political profile, leading a party called People Against Corruption, which looks less like an anti-corruption movement and more like a strategic counter to Alexei Navalny's legacy. Putin's daughters from his marriage, Maria and Katerina, hold senior academic posts in Moscow, leading billion-dollar projects in medical genetics and advanced science, both sanctioned by the West, neither showing interest in politics. Then there are the rumored sons, Ivan and Vladimir, allegedly born in 2015 and 2019 to former Olympic gymnast Alina Kabaeva. Unconfirmed, unprovable, hidden like nearly everything else about this family. If they exist, they'll be entering adulthood in the 2030s, and by then, Putin may still be in power. Here's the thing that the Putin story forces you to confront. This is a family that came from absolute nothing. No land, no title, no money, no connections. A boy sent to work at an inn during a famine, a father who limped home from a war that killed his two brothers, a son who grew up chasing rats out of a fifth-floor apartment with no hot water. And from that, one man built a grip on a country of 145 million people so tight that Western democracies are still struggling, decades later, to figure out what to do about it. Standard logic says power comes from privilege, from old money, from inherited connections. The Putins break that rule completely, which makes them, in a strange way, more dangerous, not less. Because if you're waiting for a dynasty to show its roots, to reveal the old network it came from, to behave predictably the way established powers do, you'll always be one step behind a family that built everything from scratch in secret, with nothing to lose. The real question isn't where the Putins came from, it's where they're going, and whether anyone, inside Russia or outside it, will see it coming this time.